the romantic subplot, the romance piece being more of a subplot than a huge moving piece in the
What's going to rise Webster Style, the man, the voice of fragrance, and we're here with someone that you may have seen briefly during our coverage of Atlantic Comic Con, but I was so blessed to be able to just connect with her after missing her at BlurCon due to technical issues, but to sit down and get a chance to talk with author N.D. Jones. How are you doing this evening?
I'm great. Happy Tuesday to everyone.
Yeah, it's Tuesday, Tuesday masquerading as a Monday with the not the Memorial Day, Labor Day holiday
Quite
yesterday.
true.
So it's a fake Tuesday, really. But I love talking with creatives, particularly because everybody has their, sort of motivations. And as to, in the case of one of your videos, I saw the why, as to, why they write, why they create what they create. You have written a whole host of books. Actually, no, back up. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about what sort of books you like to write. Then I'll go a bit more into the nitty gritty of it.
Okay. So, as you said, my name is N.D. Jones. I am a paranormal romance and fantasy author from Baltimore, Maryland. I've been honored to earn the USA Today bestselling status. I did that with a group of other indie authors. And so, for anyone out there who's an indie author, that the struggle is real when it comes to trying to do that USA Today or New York Times bestselling author route. It is great to work with other authors. You guys can really pull your resources. So I'm just throwing that out there because people oftentimes ask me how I acquired that particular status. And so collaboration, just like we're doing here, it goes a long way. So like I said, I started off really just writing exclusively paranormal romance. I love Black love. I love fantasy. And anytime I can blend those two in not only what I read, but what I choose to write, I do so. And then I kind of moved into the direction of more of fantasy with perhaps the romantic subplot, the romance piece being more of a subplot than a huge moving piece in the story. And my most recent release is actually released May 25th of this year, is entitled Harris Escape, Harriet Tubman Reimagined, and that was my first foray into historical fantasy fiction.
Okay. Now I have to ask, as a fellow, someone who also grew up in Baltimore, where part you from originally?
Northwest.
Okay. All right. I grew up north in Dukeland, between Poplar Grove and Dukeland Avenue. That's where I spent most of my formative years growing up until my teenage years. So, all right,
That's
cool,
it.
cool. So now you're by Harriet Tubman and a historical fiction. Harriet Tubman is a character who was a historical figure who has been used as a character in many different mediums, especially I say over the past 10, 15 years. What drew you to using her as an inspiration for the book, and how maybe does your depiction maybe differ than some of the more well-known characterizations of her?
Okay, so that's a great question. And I think it's premised on me actually having perhaps read other other stories based on her. Honestly,
Mhm,
I have not.
mhm,
A lot of the ones that I've seen geared more towards children.
mhm.
And so, at this point in my life, and not having little kids anymore, I really have an interest in doing that. But of course, coming up, we're in schools and you read kind of like the traditional stuff, right? That
Right.
you would read about Harriet Tubman. None of that was a deep dive. And oftentimes they corresponded with Black History Month. So you really received in school, when it was taught, a very shallow understanding of who she is, what she did, and why. You had that the broad um, edges of it, but honestly, it really wasn't until I started doing the research for this book in which I felt that I truly understood understood what she did, why, and all of those nuanced details, and also pulling back a lot of the myths that surrounded her, the typical characterization, blowing up her numbers, and none of that was necessary. And it was done, and it was done very deliberately. And honestly, I also did not watch the movie with Cynthia Erivo, although I am a very big Cynthia Erivo fan. And when that movie first came out, I was very excited to watch the movie, just because I'm just as a Black woman, and then also being from Maryland by default. I am a Harriet Tubman fan. I always thought that what she did was extremely courageous. Um, and like I said, I miss Erivo. I'm a fan of hers. I think she's a wonderful actress. She is a wonderful songstress. And so I was like, those two together, I want to see it. And the reason I didn't is because actually I heard some things about it that, with me being a formal social studies teacher, in which I taught Black politics, US history, American government, I was dismayed that there were a lot of, let's say, historical inaccuracies, and it kind of chilled me on it. And one of my colleagues, I work for educational system in Maryland, and one of my colleagues, who was also a social studies teacher in middle school, I was in high school, and so she went to see it, and we talked about it, and that was one of her biggest disappointments. And this was coming from, just to be transparent, like, a white former social studies teacher who understood some of this history, and she was disappointed. And that made me so disappointed. And I was like, ah. And then the fire that was in me to really want to see it, it really died, because I'm like, we could do better. We have this opportunity in this medium that is so popular, and why not do a better job with it? And so I actually never watched it. I love the soundtrack. I think it's wonderful. But I just couldn't bring myself to watch it. And so when I decided to write the book, I just, I pulled up, a lot of resources, and I created a timeline. It's a lot of work. I don't have to get into all the details of it, but I used nonfiction works, the ones that were more like the myth busters of the previous works, to really formulate my understanding, inform me about the parts of Harriet Tubman that I did not know, or did not know as well as I needed to write the type of book that I was really going for.
Okay. All right. Well, that's very refreshing that you really just went from a blank slate, not a black slate. But the act was really digging into the history to create the character of Harriet Tubman. Is really refreshing, especially considering, again, a lot of the depictions you talk about the movie, which every movie takes creative license, but you don't really want to see that much creative license where a social studies teacher walks away and like, yeah, pass on that one. So I totally understand that. Uh, but with the just your books in general, one of the things you said to me when we met back in Norfolk was, you deal in romance, you talk about Black love. How important is it to, and again, I haven't met you like that, but I just from brief conversation, I can get a sense of probably your viewpoints on this. But how important it is for you to really create, say, realistic depictions of love in these fantasy worlds, sort of juxtaposed with our general society, reducing a lot of relationships to being very transaction and materialistic.
Well, getting any kind of relationship right is always important to me. Whether they are familiar relationships, parents, siblings, or romantic relationships. The fantasy element, that's just the fun part of whether you're dealing with magic and, witches, or shapeshifters, or mythological beasts, right? But the heart of the story is always the relationship with the people. And so for me, getting that right is always important. Um, I'm I love dialogue. I take a lot of pain as far as the interactions um, with with my characters. Um, I always say, not only just what I write as far as the bio, but also in interviews that I'm really careful about trying to make truly three-dimensional characters. So characters who have certain amounts of flaws, but there's so much about them that's also great and loved. Something that characters that readers want to root for. Um, and understand, even if they do something they might not like, but you give them a reason to understand what it is that your characters are struggling with. And so when it comes to Black love and relationships, um all of that is important. I want people to enjoy the that growth of that relationship, the arc of it, because you have the individual arc, but also the arc of them being together. And then in the end, it should be this rewarding feeling that you've gone on this journey along with them. And in the end, you're like, that was so well worth it. It leaves you with this really good feeling. It doesn't mean that there's some level of perfection there, but it's a hard fought, hard earned, happily ever after. All my stuff is happily ever after, because that's the fun piece of writing romance. But you want the reader to be able to see that, to see the growth. And there's a certain amount of respect that you have to write in for characters, for themselves, but also the respect that they show their love interest. And all of that is extremely important to me, as well. So I go through a lot of pains to depict that to the best of my ability, right? And then that's not simply based on research, but it's based on having certain lived experiences.
Right.
Is based on having a certain high degree of social, emotional, and cultural intelligence. And so I find that just living life and being transparent and opening yourself up to learning, understanding, but also being critical in your thinking and critical in how you view yourself in the world. And all that is the growth. And that growth, as for you as an individual, bears out in what you write and the characters that you create. So it's impossible for an author not to find themselves in their books. And I don't mean that you're recreating situations that you've had, but your values, your beliefs, your culture, all of that, whether you are conscious of it or not, bears out in the stories that you write and the characters that you create and the situations that you put them in.
No, that makes sense. Absolutely. I would find it hard for any writer to write anything where parts of them, parts of their sensibilities, parts of their values aren't in there. Because I would imagine that someone would be comfortable writing to those strengths, personally speaking. I would think that it would be very different to write characters who are just so, or circumstances so totally outside of what you know, what you experience, what you've lived through. Not saying everything is a mirror image of what you lived through, but they're gonna be, like you said, commonalities. I mean, parts of what it is you are, what it is you've experienced, they weave their way into the circumstance because that's what you know. That totally makes sense. Now, with that though, you've written a fair number of books. How did you get started writing your novels?
Sure. The story I like to tell, and I say it as if it's not the truth, but it is my origin story. Probably well over 10 years ago. And I probably have to go back and look at the year. Well, it was the date that it came out that Reginald Hudlin had been brought on to Marvel, and that the powers that be at Marvel at the time had decided to have Storm of the X-Men, Uhura Monroe, marry King T'Challa, aka the Black Panther. And like I said, Hudlin was brought on to facilitate that change. And so he wrote, I think, maybe a couple of the maybe of the X-Men, and then eventually wrote Black Panther. So I hadn't heard anything about it. And my husband, because he understands the type of wife that he married, he was like, "Hey, did you know this thing was going on?" I'm like, "No." I was like, I'm so there for that. And that was actually my first time being a true blue comic book reader. Now I was always into fantasy, but I never read comic books. I have four older brothers. They never really read comic books either, so they weren't really in my home. So it was like books that exist that's out there in the part of the popular culture, but no one really around me read comics, even though we watched the equivalent Saturday, morning cartoons, right? I don't know if they still have that, but when I came up, we had Saturday morning cartoons and I
Right.
watched stuff like that. So that was my first exposure. And I said, wow, I love this, but both of them with their powers, I love them individually, but to put them together, and I really, and I enjoyed it. And I kept saying, man, I want more of this. And it really segued into me writing fan fiction, because
Mhm.
you know how it goes. You read something, it's never exactly the way you want it, right? Because,
Right.
well, you're not writing it. And I was always like, man, where are these gaps? And so I started filling in those gaps. So for a while, I initially wrote fan fiction with Black Panther and Storm. And then I moved into, other couples like Wonder Woman and Superman. You always had that, that group
Mhm.
group of fans who always wanted them to be the pairing, not Lois Lane and all that stuff. And so you had that, but that's really what it was. It was that Black love story, and the fact that it was truly unprecedented, which is a whole different piece over here about really showcasing Black love in its various beautiful forms. And then me wanting more of that and looking around and not truly seeing it in the public domain the way I wanted to consume it. And so I
Mhm.
spent several years really writing fan fiction. And then one day I read an article. It started off as an article that listed a lot of very popular and famous authors who they said to fan fiction writers like me, like, I don't want you writing my characters. And it's like, I can actually I get that, right? Like, don't write these characters.
Mhm.
But I read this article, and one of the authors said something that I thought it was true, and it was very impactful, and it changed the trajectory of me being a writer. And she simply said this: why spend so much time writing another author's character when you can put all that energy into writing characters that you own? And it's like, yeah, that's absolutely true. I work all day. I will come home. I would churn out a chapter here, churn out
Mhm.
another chapter. And then when you start looking at all those chapters that you're writing 15, 20, 30 chapters. Well, that's a book. And
Right.
then you write another fan fiction story. That's another book. So when you start to calculate all that, you're like, wow, maybe on fan fiction alone, I've written X number of books. I don't own any of that. And so I found a lot of truth in that particular article, in which these authors said, I don't want people writing my characters. Go out and do something else. But it was true. I was spending so much time writing other people's characters. And so I started saying, I can segue this. I've shown that I can write, that there's an audience. People seem to enjoy what I've done, and I can hone this craft, but with my own characters.
Okay. I mean, that makes total sense. I think we are, as creators, we're all inspired by those sort of things that we're passionate about. And I think all of us, whether you write or you draw, like you start by emulating what you love. And a lot of us tend to then realize, hey, we should be doing this with the things that we want to create. But that
Mm.
makes total sense. And you said something as far as the Stormy Black Panther, as far as how it would just, and I forget the words you used, but it wasn't atypical for the time, and it was very significant. And even with Marvel, somebody who read comic books, especially back then, like all the time, you did have black characters who were in love, who were this and that. But I find it amazing that it took that event of Helen coming over for anybody to get the idea to say, hey, these are our literally two most prominent black characters across the whole company. Why don't we get them together? Like it never dawned on anybody. And that's amazing to me that it never happened before then. But also one of the things, especially how they were written, it's not so much about the powers they have. It was very much about that story was so significant because of the power of their individual characters and how well those characters were fleshed out before Harlan came in, and how deep he really just dove into the characters themselves, but also with that love story. And it was just one of those things that I would say the best equivalent of a love story I've seen to those sort of ups and downs, like sort of quote unquote real life, it's probably Mary Jane and Peter Parker. And that's not with every writer. But I think that was some writers in the past have done a very good job of depicting real love with those characters. But those characters are, in a sense, everyday people. With the Child in Aurora, you literally have a king and a goddess, and then you explore that as well as their humanity in their love as well. And I thought it was just so unique, and just surprised nobody ever done it before. So I can understand why that would start fan fiction.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll just say a couple of points. One is when you talk about them as individuals, and then their growth, for example. I think Coates, Ta-Nehisi Coates,
Mhm.
he did an amazing job, I think, overall with them. And the reason I say that is because, especially with Storm, but he really explored the whole concept of intersectionality with her. I remember reading passages in which she was speaking about being a woman, about being a mutant, about
Mhm.
being, African American, and the push pull, and what that really meant for her. And it's like, how many authors in comics, one, understands what that even means, and then
Right.
two, would think about a way to integrate that into the comic, and to let that be something that a character would say, which we understand as readers. With her being a Black woman in the comic, we understand that, yes, these are experiences that she would have had, but we needed an author with a certain type of mindset to put
Right.
that into her mouth, and to integrate that into the story. And I really think that he did a great job with really showing them as equals, and having someone as prideful as T'Challa open up to her, and asking for her help. And it was just so many layers to it that I
Right.
think that he did well, when you look at these Black love relationships. And it's a lot more that I can say on, as far as how other people have written them, and chose to show that relationship. But I think those optics, that they are extremely important. And because we do not have a plethora of examples of Black love stories
Mhm.
in the more mainstream media, I think anytime we do, we have to be super careful with how we write them.
Yes.
Because when they are written poorly, it's highlighted to such a degree, more than it probably should, because there are so few examples. Now you juxtapose that to all these different, white love relationships. You can screw those up 1,000 times over. Why? Because you have 1,000 more great
Right.
examples of what it looks like, but you don't have the equivalency with Black love. So when you ask me about the pains that I take to try to get it right, that's
Mhm.
part of what I think about in trying to get it right. Now,
Mhm.
right is subjective, but I do think, as a writer, that there is a certain level of consciousness that you need to have when you're thinking about creating these Black love characters.
I That's true, and I'm gonna go back to something you said before, because even that speaks to Coach's run. Because I actually, that's like, I think I have like the first two or three trays of that, so I know exactly what you're talking about. That lived experience, that understanding. You need an author who has an understanding to really write the truth about it, so to speak. And in order to be able to do that, so it's going to write a story, especially a love story in that way, you need someone who really understands, like, okay, the real life maybe motivations or background of these characters, much like you talked about with their whole intersectionality with Storm, and how even her and T'Challa interact. You know, not saying that other writers haven't done a good or a decent job writing either one of those characters in the past, regardless of their background and ethnicity. But there's something about when you can inject yourself into that character, your lived experience into that character, that always, and I mean always, regardless of what color, creed the character is, it always, the character in the story always comes away better because you're not making it up, you lived it. So there's a passion, there's a heart that comes across from the pen onto the page. And then especially if you're doing comics, then the artist gets that and they depict that passion as well. In your case with your novels, you know, these are all things that are, we see these images in our head, and how exquisitely they're written, and just paint this picture based on where it comes from in your mind and your heart. So that's you know, that's always a key part of things in my opinion.
Absolutely. Thank
So now I want to ask you a question because and I told you before, like I mentioned to a friend of mine, like I had, well, no, she had seen my interview. She's like, oh, I love her books. I was like, that's so
you.
cool. Um so what sort of, how has it been really growing your following and getting notoriety, and in some respects just starting to get that, starting to get that notoriety for what you've done, especially being in USA Today and everything?
Honestly, I'm saying that that's something that I'm constantly still working on.
Mhm.
I think you know this already. A lot of authors are introverts, so anything that
Mhm.
I do, it's like that extra energy. It doesn't require a lot for me to come home, sit up on the computer, and just type. Right, look at a
Right.
screen, and you get that research done, and you churn it out. And I always say that's, believe it or not, that's always like the easiest piece. But the marketing piece is a lot harder. Trying to do social media and be consistent with that, I'm truly not. I try to be consistent, and I try, and I go through, kind of like exercise, right? You start off strong, and then you kind of like go down a little bit and try to come back up. I try to be really consistent with that. What I have been consistent with the last couple of years, really since we kind of came out of the pandemic, is
Mhm.
I'm really committed to doing more live face-to-face event, which meeting people like you. That's been great for me to help me come out of my shell some. Once I'm engaged in a conversation, I'm just fine. But I think meeting people where they are, I found that there are so many different places where an author can go that you can find readers. So there's different types of festivals that I'll go to, especially, like different like African American festivals. I have one in Sandy Springs, Maryland, in a couple of weeks on the 14th actually, and that's at this Slave Heritage Museum. And out that I got that from connection with a colleague, and he writes nonfiction. So what I found is that when you put yourself out there, when you put yourself in places where you can meet people,
Mhm.
that's one of the best way that you can grow as a person, grow as a professional. You make connections oftentimes just by being yourself. I find that because I now have a decent body of work, that when I set it up, and the covers that I have, people find that to be impressive. And for
Mhm.
me, it's just like I write one book at a time. And so at one point, I went to an event and I had like one or two books. So all that stuff takes time. But I think it's just kind of like putting yourself out there, not being afraid to say, hey, this is my work. Try it out. A lot of times when I sell a book to someone at, the both of the events, for example, where we met and had a conversation, I tell people genuinely, you have my social media, reach out, let me know what you think. I
Right.
love, you love your feedback, because we write in a silo, and you don't really know what people think or how they're feeling unless they tell you. And it's good to know. It's good to hear. It's good to know what people are thinking. If they got out of it what you hope and what you intended them to get out of, maybe I can do more of something, less of something else. But that's really what it is for me, kind of like getting out there, doing more of these events, meeting people face to face. And I've found that that's actually been like my best form of marketing, just these one-on-one types of conversations, and just being honest and being transparent. And that's just kind of who I am as a person overall. And I think it shows.
Okay, well, I definitely agree. Just based on my interaction with you and just seeing, how those at the various conventions really interact, and even my friends like, "Oh my God, I love her," sort of thing. Like, yeah, you're definitely making Martin. I think that's really cool. No, quick question before I let you go, because I was watching some of your videos. So I know you got your PhD. So you got your PhD from Howard. What is your
Mhm.
PhD in?
My I had to make sure I give these schools credit.
Okay,
My master's is from Howard, and there
okay,
I did
master from
American
Howard.
government, Black politics.
Okay,
But I'm also in education. So my doctorate, my EDD, is from Morgan State here in Maryland,
okay, I got
and
that
so
confused.
that's in community college leadership. So yeah, so I've been in education for 30 years. Like I
Okay,
said, social studies teacher, social studies department chair, and for like the last maybe 12 years, I've done professional development with adult learners in one of our
okay,
local school systems.
okay. All right. Well, I'm not gonna hold you any longer. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Let everybody know where they can find your wonderful books.
Absolutely. If you want to go to my website, I am Ed.D Jones paranormalpleasure.com. On social media, most places I am Ed.D Jones author. So that's TikTok, that's Instagram, that's X, formerly Twitter. I also have a YouTube channel and Pinterest as well. So again, that's Ed.D Jones author, most places.
Thank you very much. Now, you guys should have seen that flash across the screen. If you missed it and you don't feel like going back to pause it and write everything down, you'll see everything in the show notes. Andy, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
You guys check her out.
Appreciate it.
Webster Style of Manwords Fragrance. We'll see you again next time. Peace.
Well, hello, hello, baby. This is your lovely Misty Stone, and you are watching Webster Style with me.